We can think of the Age of Constantine as an era which in some ways acts as a bridge between the classical world of the Pax Romana and the Byzantine Age, even the early medieval world. Some historians have also called this period Late Antiquity. And overall, this time period has a reputation for being economically troubled, but this dire picture isn't the whole story. Some regions thrived, showing resilience and growth. Others indeed did not do so well. On this episode of the Pax Romana podcast, I want to think about the economy of this era, focusing on agriculture, urbanization, money, the state, and the economy of the growing Christian church. What are the defining features of this late antique economy? How influential was Constantine himself in shaping this economy? And what were the big challenges and transformations? So let's talk about the economy of the Age of Constantine on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 87, Constantine's Economy. As I mentioned in the introduction, I want to take a moment to think about the economy of the Age of Constantine. That is, what did things look like in agriculture, urbanization, the monetary system, the finances of the Roman state, and the Christian church from roughly the beginning of the 4th century AD to around the middle of that same century. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is a pivotal time. It's also a somewhat controversial time among historians. Was this a bad economy? Was it a good economy? Was it a fractured economy where some places were doing well and other places weren't? Or where some aspects of the economy were doing well and other aspects weren't? I want to start out, like I said, with agriculture, which if you haven't gotten this from the podcast already, you should get it now. And that is that agriculture was the lifeblood of the Roman Empire. Everything was sustained by the fields. Millions of people, the animals that did so much labor in the Roman Empire. And this was true across the Roman Empire, from the fields in the island of Great Britain to the flooded plains of Egypt's Nile Valley. And during the reign of Constantine the Great, farming faced significant challenges, but there was also some innovation in agriculture as well. As the empire transitioned from the chaos of the 3rd century into this late antique period, agriculture remained the foundation of the economy, feeding cities, armies, and acting as a major producer of trade goods. Constantine's policies, which very much built on earlier reforms, including those by his predecessor Diocletian, sought to address some of those issues. They also reshaped rural society in some ways that ended up lasting well beyond Constantine's lifetime. A major issue under Constantine and his successors was abandoned lands, that is, fields that went fallow for a few different reasons. Some of these reasons were environmental, some social, some economic. So the 3rd and 4th centuries saw changes in the climate of the Mediterranean. Overall, that region became cooler and drier. There were more droughts, and crop yields began to diminish. Areas that had once been fertile became swamplands or were taken over by forests. Obviously, warfare during this time also had an effect on land abandonment, so barbarian raids, particularly in the western half of the Roman Empire, in places like Gaul, for example. There were tribes like the Franks and the Alemanni, which crossed over the Rhine. It's very difficult to farm in that otherwise fertile region when your villages and your farms are being looted. Obviously, farmers do not want to stick around in areas where there is high potential for war. Then there was, of course, overtaxation. We mentioned the reforms of Diocletian, in which the emperor attempted to more thoroughly and closely monitor taxation in his empire. Well, naturally, people are going to struggle if their taxes go up. And there are plenty of hints in the sources, some coming from papyrus documents in Egypt, others in literary sources, that describe fields being left fallow because their owners could not pay taxes. Constantine tried to solve some of the issues with abandoned land by granting tax reductions to targeted regions. Another thing Constantine did was send military veterans and even some of the peoples that he defeated to take over abandoned lands and to try their hand at cultivating those areas, bringing them back into production, which of course would then enable the state to tax them. So it was kind of a win-win for everybody. In some cases, he paired gifts of land with subsidies of money or grain to encourage cultivation. And especially by sending foreigners to these lands, Constantine was also seeking to resolve some foreign policy challenges. If outsiders were just granted land within the Roman Empire, they wouldn't then have any need to go and fight and kill Romans. They could just have some lands. This, especially in the West, would be a strategy that would, at least in part, backfire, but at least under Constantine, it seemed like there might be some promise in doing this. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all agriculture in the Roman Empire under Constantine was under strain. There were some places which appear to have done just fine. North Africa, for example, Tunisia, Algeria. Olive oil production seems to have been high, at least insofar as we can measure the production of the clay jars that transported olive oil from those regions. One thing that probably supported the olive oil trade was the growing church, and I'll mention this later, but because Christians met inside, there was an increased need for oil for lamps. And at least in the 4th century, Roman Africa did not struggle with any obvious foreign invaders. Now, that would change in the 5th century, but at least in the 4th century, that relative peace also promoted prosperity in Roman North Africa. So that's what things looked like in the countryside in the age of Constantine. But what about in the cities? Well, as it turns out, there was a lot happening in the cities. Not just the big thing that we talked about last time, the founding of the new capital of Constantinople and Constantine's massive building program in that city, but I would say there was a general shift in urbanization away from the west and towards the east. So cities in Gaul, for example, as well as cities along the Danube River, seem to have shrunk in population, at least based on archaeological surveys and literary accounts, maybe losing up to half their populations. Part of that was no doubt due to the economic situation in the hinterland that I've already kind of talked about, with an agricultural sector around those cities being gradually unable to feed the urban populations. But also there was the warfare. And we see evidence of this in the walls that show up around some of the cities in the Western Roman Empire. And these walls tend to surround a smaller area than the extent of those cities in the classical period. So that tells us two things: that the area of the cities had shrunk, and probably the population, but also that resources in those cities needed to be spent increasingly on defense. Now, just as with the rural side of things, the urban economy was not entirely under threat. It was especially beneficial for your city if the emperor favored it in some way. So cities like Trier, for example, seem to have done just fine under Constantine. Constantinople obviously did very well, and Carthage and Leptis Magna in North Africa. Olive oil and grain exporting cities seem to have thrived. So did Mainz along the Rhine border, primarily because it was an important military city. So even in the West, where there was a general picture of economic decline, imperial beneficence could preserve and even expand the fortunes of some Western cities. I also wanted to say a little bit about money, and I hinted about Constantine's monetary reforms in the last couple of episodes, and I want to go ahead and tell you exactly what happened. It's kind of interesting, and it follows after some of what we have discussed about the monetary crisis of the 3rd century. So if you remember the 3rd century, it was a time when emperors rose and fell very quickly. There were civil wars, invasions, and monetary inflation. In order to pay soldiers quickly and without access to precious metal, emperors and would-be emperors debased the silver coinage so that they could offer nominal pay increases without actually having additional precious metal. In a very short time, the quality of Roman silver coinage tanked, going down to something like 1 to 5% silver and the rest copper. Diocletian, as we saw, tried to arrest price inflation by instituting strict and comprehensive empire-wide wage and price controls. Those, of course, failed as well. Constantine decided to do something different. Around 310 AD, when he hadn't even taken over half the Roman Empire yet, Constantine began using a pure gold coin called the solidus. This coin replaced the reduced weight and partially debased gold aureus, which had circulated in the Roman Empire for over 300 years. The solidus, which sounds kind of fancy to our English ears, was actually a soldier slang term for a gold coin. But this was no junky piece of money. Constantine's solidus was high purity, its design was simple, and was standardized at 72 coins per pound of gold. And Constantine's descendants kept this coin stable. The solidus remained unchanged in weight and purity for centuries, becoming the backbone not just of Constantine's economy, but the economy of the Byzantine Empire. It was a coin that had such a good brand that future coins, like the Italian soldi and the French sou, derive from solidus. As a result of a stable gold coin, trade, taxes, and loans increased in the 4th century, and something like normal commerce returned in the cities. And as you might imagine, elites, wealthy merchants, military officers, bureaucrats used these coins frequently. For large transactions, they could buy land, they could pay their taxes. And because this coin was a reliable gold coin, other currencies in the Roman Empire, most notably the bronze coinage, floated in value against the solidus. And that kind of represents maybe the darker side of Constantine's monetary reform. The bronze coins were completely unanchored, and Constantine and his successors minted these coins in high numbers. They end up not really having much of a clear denominational structure. At some points, people would just bag huge amounts of bronze coins and essentially sell them by weight. So although the monetary economy worked really well for elites and the wealthy, for the poor, the monetary system remained a bit of a mess. This disparity became especially problematic when the poor had to pay their taxes in cash because they had to do so often in gold. And with exchange rates being all over the place, just to get the gold coin to pay the taxes often meant taking a loss. Speaking of taxes, by the way, Constantine's regime benefited in many ways from Diocletian's reforms. Constantine did not have to be the bad guy in setting up a massive tax bureaucracy, closing loopholes, and a variety of other measures that Diocletian and the tetrarchs pursued to exact as much tax from the Roman Empire as possible. That was already in place. Constantine merely benefited from it. What Constantine does appear to have done was to convert some of the in-kind taxes that had existed because, in no small part, due to the monetary chaos of the 3rd century and early 4th century, so many taxes were paid in kind. Constantine wanted those taxes, like I said, paid in gold. So rather than having poor farmers pay taxes directly with the produce of their fields, they had to take the produce, sell it for gold coins. They took a loss on those transactions, and then they had to pay the gold to the state. Now, I don't know if Constantine was aware of this or not, but obviously this taxation system put further emphasis on gold, increasing the demand for gold, and therefore benefited elites that held gold and transacted in gold. One of the ways the poor could pay these taxes is by asking their patrons or their landlords to use their gold to pay the taxes, and then the field workers, the sharecroppers, the coloni would owe the value of the taxes in the form of labor or produce to those patrons. So this taxation system was not so good for the poor. It was pretty good for the elite and the landowners, and it was very good for the state because it ensured that a steady stream of gold was constantly returning back into the imperial treasury. But it wasn't just taxes that provided Constantine with influxes of wealth. Let me say something about the influence of Christianity on the late antique economy, especially under Constantine. Because of his conversion to Christianity, Constantine now had a legitimate reason to go after the treasuries of pagan temples. In the years after Constantine's conversion, he confiscated gold, silver, and bronze from these temples, especially in the 330s. Christians were ecstatic about these moves, not so much for their financial implications, but because of their spiritual implications. Here, Christians who were persecuted just a few decades earlier now got to see the temples of their former tormentors looted by the Roman emperor. And in fact, some of that money probably went to Christian churches. We know as early as the Edict of Milan, which, as we talked about previously, was issued in 313 AD, that edict mandated the restoration of properties confiscated from Christians during Diocletian's persecution. And in the case of lands or goods that couldn't be recovered, Constantine ordered Christians and churches compensated in money. This was a transfer of wealth from paganism to Christianity. And in turn, with these vast resources suddenly available to them, Christians, and especially Christian leaders, used church funds to buy lands. And it wasn't just imperial money. Constantine issued orders to provincial governors to redirect some of their funds to Christian institutions in various regions on a local level as well. Church infrastructure, that is, church buildings, charitable facilities, eventually even hospitals, were constructed using this wealth and on these lands. And in the Roman Empire, where land was so important to elites, it's unsurprising that many former senators and equestrians and other wealthy Romans decided that now might be a good time to convert to Christianity and maybe even take up leadership positions in the church. The fact is, church property was not democratically controlled. It was controlled through leaders, especially bishops. And Roman elites could read the tea leaves. Why try to manage diminishing senatorial patrimonies in the West when you could instead become bishops and manage the increasing land portfolios of the church? It also helped that Constantine afforded bishops all sorts of legal rights and privileges as well. These would have all been familiar to senators who had plenty of experience in the courts. So one of the effects of this transfer of wealth from what we might call the pagan sector of the Roman Empire to the Christian sector was also a transfer of elites. So there were social changes that occurred because of economic changes. So I hope you can see from all of this that the economy of Constantine was not necessarily an economy in distress. It was also not prosperous everywhere, but it was in many ways a transitional economy. Some parts of the agricultural economy were seeing mass abandonment of lands, and yet other parts of the rural Roman Empire, especially in places like North Africa, were doing well. Cities were shrinking in much of the West. They were surging in population in much of the East. Monetary stability seems to have been in the cards for elites, especially those that used gold coins, but for those dependent upon bronze coins, they continued to deal with inflation and monetary instability. And those in the church did better than those who were not Christians. The fact is, the imperial state was picking winners and losers, in some cases intentionally, in other cases unintentionally. And as a result, the Roman Empire was transitioning into something very different than the world of the Pax Romana. Economic forces were a major part of this shift. But so too was politics. As we'll see in the next episode, Constantine would eventually die, and his empire would be split among his relatives. The divisions in Roman society became even more stark, and political realities mirrored those divisions. As we'll see in the coming episodes of this podcast, East and West could not remain together, and the unified Roman Empire that Constantine had built would eventually crumble and permanently sunder. We will talk about the disintegration of the Roman Empire on the next few episodes of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.